Ghost of Tsushima was an incredibly interesting experience for me. Before I talk about that exact experience, I want to discuss 2 years ago. In 2022, I ended up picking up the director's cut of Ghost of Tsushima. I had heard many great things and really wanted to love this game from the get-go, but I couldn't. And after the first attempt of trying to play it, I ended up not giving this game a go for over a year simply because I either had other videos to work on or it was the case that I just had other games that I wanted to play. So it just ended up coming down to the simple issue of not having enough time. When I did try it out a year ago, I intended to make a video about it. I was going into it solely through that lens of wanting to make one big masterpiece of a video, and I was struggling to care much about it. I played the first 90 minutes and closed the game and didn't pick it up for another 3 months. I restarted the game on that occasion as well and ran into the exact same issue. And it left me thinking that the game was simply not for me. However, this wasn't true. The issue stemmed from 2 issues in particular. One was that I simply wasn't ready to be playing this game, and the other was that when I was trying to play this game for the first time, I was going into it with the sole intent of making a video. I wasn't thinking about it in the correct way. The way that I should have been playing this game originally was through the lens of wanting to play something and take in the game as a whole, instead of what can I take away from it. And you might be asking what changed, and to answer that question really quickly, it's simply put, I took a step back from YouTube. I stopped relying on it as my main source of income, and it made making videos really just how it used to feel. And the other is a concept that I intend to develop deeper, not in this video but within another, about this idea of feeling inspired to play games, and in this case inspired to play Ghost of Tsushima. When it comes to history, Japan has always been a super interesting topic. However, it was never something that I ever found myself truly wanting to immerse myself into. I love the idea of it, but generally, it's not something that I was pushing myself to learn about, indulge in, or care too much about. This is another reason why I struggled. However, in July, me and my girlfriend went away to Spain, and for 10 days I did a lot of thinking. And the primary topic that I was thinking about whilst I was away was around this idea of whether or not I should be taking a step back from YouTube. And as previously mentioned, as you can tell, I chose to do exactly that. I ended up getting a job to alleviate that stress. And also, during our time away, I wanted to disconnect from what I consider the toxic side of the internet and just using YouTube all the time for every single form of content that I'm consuming. So for the first time in ages, I chose to actually dedicate time to watching a show again, and the show of choice was Shogun, which made me incredibly inspired to play Ghost of Tsushima. The show allowed me to get immersed into the time setting, the vibe, and the politics of the world in Japan. I thoroughly enjoyed the show, everything from the Englishman experiencing Japan's culture for the first time and seeing the brutal realities of its way of life. The thing to know for this video is that it gave me permission to end up in the right state of mind to play this game. It was the show that allowed me and inspired me to actually give this game a proper shot. And once we were halfway through the show, it ended up making me want to do one thing, which was the moment I got home, I wanted to go ahead and play Ghost of Tsushima. It could be the case that you need to watch some form of show, movie, read a book of any particular type, or maybe play a different game that is within the same genre-ish as the game that you want to be getting into. And this is what really helped me dive deep into truly giving this game a proper shot. Finally, I chose to give it a proper chance, and it was a breathtaking experience. This game made me feel things I haven't felt in a very long time with a game in particular. It was able to immerse me within the world that I had always wanted to enjoy, and gave me an appreciation for something I didn't feel I would ever get to the point of truly enjoying. I felt on the brink of tears. I felt like a complete monster who could slice through anyone, and like a true demon who was able to go unseen and destroy everyone within his path without anyone seeing what happened. I don't know how long this video is going to be, however, whatever length it does end up, I hope that it is of great value in terms of content. I do believe that this is probably the best script that I've put together, and I hope to make the video as good as I possibly can so that you guys can enjoy it in whatever way you want. If you want to use the timestamps to watch this video, go ahead. There's no pressure to watch it all in one sitting, but if you do, thank you, as that does help my retention, so there you go. So grab a cup of tea and join me in discussing the game that was a breath of fresh air in the swamp of many games that I haven't enjoyed over the last few years. And that game in particular is Ghost of Tsushima. The game starts off with the Khan and his armies from the Mongol Empire invading Tsushima. Jin Sakai, his uncle Lord Shimura, and their bannermen are the last line of defense to ensure the island withstands such a massive attack. The samurai are waiting and send off their best soldier to do a 1 versus 1 combat duel. An honourable fight that either one, the Mongols leave or they fight. This shows us our first inclination as to just how smart the Khan truly is. He had no intention of playing the same game as them, as he proceeds to light a samurai to flames. We're then brought into playing the game for the first time, charging into battle. We are fighting the Mongols, taking as many down as possible, but as we keep pushing, we find ourselves taken down by arrows, and with that, Shimura has been captured. We wake up on top of a hill with none of our gear and walk into the village that is currently on fire. We end up meeting one of the best characters within the game, Yuna, and she tells us how she actually saved Jin in this moment, and particularly how he can't just go out and fight them, as it would be unnecessary if he did so, as he would just die anyway. So instead, he chooses to follow her and hide to stay alive. We sneak around, giving us a tutorial into the stealth of this game, and Jin is constantly feeling at odds with his nature. We collect our sword and go into a flashback with Jin and Shimura. We go through a basic tutorial of how to attack, block, and stagger our opponents. I personally prefer this system of teaching us things in this game, as it allows us to, realize that he is meant to be this samurai, this almighty figure who can fight with the blade, and he shouldn't just be learning this as he's going on, and the game shouldn't be teaching us as if he didn't already know prior to this fight. Jin will now use his family's blade to take down the spearmen. Instead of sneaking around them, Jin holds true with his upbringing and fights the Mongols in his way head on. After saving a man and child, we'll head to the stables and make a big decision. Which horse do we want to take? I ended up choosing the pure white one, and I chose the name Nobu. We ride to the castle and fight our way to the main gate, in which we meet the Khan. He gives us the luxury of a duel, but he's too powerful for us to do anything, and he'll hit us down into the river. As we are falling, Jin has another flashback, revealing the moment he watched his father die, and then him walking through his home to the burning of his father's body. He will start talking to his uncle and then suddenly awake on the beach. Jin is still thinking of the death of his father. Once we find our way to the horses and to Yuna, we'll be riding away and get the title card of Ghost of Tsushima, doing what this game does best, which is showing us a beautiful cinematic experience. Then we'll be sent on our way, which is where I want to interrupt this quick explanation of the story, and I do mean that this is a quick explanation in comparison to other videos that I've done. When it comes to it, I do want to discuss the side characters, and I'm going to be dedicating time to their side content in a moment in the video. However, I'm only going to reference the intro of most of these characters in this beginning part talking about the story, because these are the only relevant parts that are mandatory when it comes to playing with these characters. When it comes to diving deep into their subplots and their own stories in general, I will be dedicating that time in the side content section, so don't worry, I will be getting there in a moment. To begin with, we head off with Yuna to hopefully save her brother, who's a blacksmith. This brings us to the first moment of true chaos within Jin's mind. He'll do his first assassination, and with that have flashbacks to what it means to be a samurai, specifically focusing on attacking the enemy from behind. It's dishonorable and therefore something a samurai wouldn't do. We also have a scene with the Khan and Shimura, where he says he'll never let the people of Tsushima become slaves. Now these interruptions happen very few times, and honestly I don't know how I feel about them. They are there to continue the story, but they also feel in a way out of place and as if they're, just there to progress the plot without too much substance to them. And overall, just to kind of make it feel as if something is happening other than what we are seeing. After this, I then went to start doing side content, only the essential ones to begin with, which are basically just the first ones of each type. I first went to Sensei Ishiwakada, which starts off the story about his student betraying him. You can tell from the get-go that something feels off about this entire situation, but that is all I'll say about this. Once again, when we actually get to the part talking about their parts of the story, then I'll give my thoughts on this. We also get our first quest with Masako and her family having been slaughtered, and again, like I just said, I'll talk more in detail about these things and how I believe they're interesting or not interesting later on. But this quest in particular is one that really portrays one of the main themes of this game that I'll be focusing on. To continue on the main story, we head off to this location to help Yuna's brother Taka out of the camp that he is held hostage within. We will sneak into this, and this is definitely one of the most memorable missions in the game, as it's one of the few that forcefully use stealth-focused mechanics, and, in my opinion, makes it way more worthwhile to begin with when you do certain things like this. We'll meet Kenji and he'll help us get into the fort. And when we find Taka, we'll find him incredibly disturbed and a shadow of the man that he will eventually become. I went on to do the mission with Rizo, who is supposed to be our friend who betrays us later. And one thing that I'll mention currently, and I will discuss even more in depth when it comes to Rizo's entire plotline, is that I genuinely find it insane that they try and portray in this game that these guys were friends in any way, especially when you get later on into the game. Like, nothing. There is nothing there that would make you think that these two people are genuinely friends. There's nothing at all. I don't understand how this is somehow being pushed in this game, but, you know, if they want to do that, they want to do that. And even in this current moment, right at the beginning of this game, you can tell that they are not that friendly. This seems way more adversarial than it does anything close to friendship. We spend 2 missions with Rizo, which ends up focusing on us taking down the Mongols together and trying to gather food and supplies for his starving men back in his camp, which the group's name is the Straw Hats, which appear to be some form of mercenary group, or like a older version or more skilled warriors who didn't become samurais. Next up on the chopping block for us is to head off and take back a town that has a great forge that Taka needs so that he can make something amazing. Within this, we protect the town, rally up the people, and make sure they're safe, and within these moments, the tale of the ghost becomes one. It's the first time in this game it's truly becoming an idea on the player's mind. We are the Ghost of Tsushima, a tale that is needed and a man that is required to save the place that he lives within. During this time that we are defending this location, the grappling hook ends up being created, and almost as if it was perfect timing and just gameplay mechanic stuff, Rizo appears and he needs our help to take on an encampment where his men has been taken hostage. We get to properly test out the grappling hook, and this has to be one of the most fun parts of the parkour and movement within this game. This mission really allows you to enjoy this thoroughly. This mission is one that I actually really enjoyed. It ends up sowing the seeds for many things that might be afoot later. His men were fed and seemingly decently happy enough. This all brings us to the end of Act 1, which has to be one of the most enjoyable missions that I've played within this entire game. It just has a bit of everything going on, and this game lacks in one thing in particular, which is long missions, so when they do happen, they are typically pretty special. As we start the mission, Shadow of the Samurai, we get a cut back to the castle and witness yet again another conversation between the Khan and Lord Shimura. When he mentions that his men have been found with stab marks in their back, this is the first bit of the game trying to show us the internal conflict between the samurais. This mission, we end up joined by all of the characters that we've met along the way, and we end up starting to scale the castle. We have some great stealth moments and also some great combat moments as to be expected. We find our way inside and Rizo is there. We were waiting for him to show up earlier, but he didn't. In this moment, he chooses to betray us and takes the Khan's side. This moment weirdly gave me Anakin versus Obi-Wan vibes, not in the scope that you get within Star Wars, but in terms of how it's meant to feel to Jin as a betrayal. This was actually a harder fight at first for me, the second one wasn't so much. We'll get into that though when I talk about the gameplay mechanics later. With this one though, after being defeated, he runs off like a coward instead of taking his honourable death. We make our way inside and get Shimura out of imprisonment. He will join us as we head out and fight the remaining warriors. It will fade to black and reopen with the Khan having made it to Shimura's castle, and making Rizo show his loyalty by lighting fellow Japanese men of Tsushima to burn within the moments that you can then end up seeing his pain for the first proper time. Again, it reminds me of the Anakin sort of arc. The Khan is the Emperor who feels nothing in these moments, but Rizo, he is someone who's actually suffering in these moments, but he believes that he's doing something that is for the betterment of his people, that you can easily argue has far more to do with his own ego and the ability to survive himself. Once we are back to our own reality, we meet up with Jin's uncle yet again, and he will give us a slight scolding for the tactics that have been used. Within these moments, you can see that he knows he could never have gotten out of prison if it wasn't for those tactics having been used, but he also knows that it's against the samurai code. Which this shows to me, however, is that this game was going to intend some form of honor system in some way, and I went around my entire playthrough thinking this to be the case, and I will be discussing in a bit about how much I think that this was wasted potential. We head out with Shimura, seeing what the Mongols have done in their rage heading north, and it looks like a wasteland in comparison to what we've experienced prior. After going through the encampment, we will see the disconnect for Yuna from Shimura, and we end up learning more about the events of what happened within this area of the map. She is sent to help him bring her people to fight against the Mongols in exchange for passage to the mainland with Taka. We're also sent to go collect the armor of Clan Sakai. As Act 1 comes to an end, we have new barriers to take down and new people to meet. And this act acted in a way to try and build the tensions that will arise even more later on through the story, but its primary focus was building up this idea that the people of Tsushima needed to fight off this invasion, and the only way that they can do that is through the story of the Ghost. The one that doesn't play by the same rules that the Mongols believe all the samurai do, the one that actually takes things into his own hands and ends up doing tactics that will make the Mongols run in fear. Once we are down to the bottom of the tower, we find ourselves talking to a monk called Norio, who will have his own set of quests as well. I went off to collect the armor. We go into the house that is of Clan Sakai and see the armor is gone. An old woman comes to hit us, but she recognizes us. Her name is Yuriko. She is the housemaid of sorts. I don't actually know what the name in particular would be for her title, but yeah, that's the best description that I can give for the moment. She takes us to our armor, and while they prepare it, we head off to see Jin's father's grave and meditate. It's the same place that we've seen within the flashbacks at the beginning of the game, and it's a beautiful place as we see it for the first time in person. We then head back, collect our armor, and it spooks him a little bit, making him have a slight flashback yet again to his father's death. As we come to exit, we end up coming across a few Straw Hats, and they want to come and kill us, so, you know, we just kill them instead. We head off to an area by the lake with Yuriko, and which, again, we have gone to before in the flashbacks with Shimura. We speak to her about building a poison that could be used to fight off the Mongols. We end up collecting the flowers needed, and create these poison darts. We end up testing them out on some Straw Hats who are searching for us, another element of this game that reminds me of Assassin's Creed titles, hence again why so many people see similarities between this title and how it's meant to be the perfect embodiment of what an RPG Assassin's Creed should be. The moment I was out of this mission, I did instantly upgrade the armor, and it has to be the most badass samurai gear I've ever seen. Unlike a lot of the armor in this game, it actually has some good benefits as well and isn't just mediocre. The main story does continue. The first one that I did anyway was getting Shimura's message to the mainland. This mission, oddly enough, reminded me of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. It's a similar vibe anyway. And it's also one of the few missions with the main man himself, and it actually just helps with building up this sense of honorable versus the dishonorable actions that might be happening. Shimura at first is against the choices to use, for example, the big weapon that shoots a load of arrows and sets loads of things aflame. However, he gives us the okay anyway, as he realizes that it's kind of a necessary evil. To help the boat get past the blockade, we end up taking down each boat that comes in front of it, one at a time. It's one of the most unique missions in this game, but it does really remind me of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. We learn that with the note that Shimura sent to the mainland, he's also requesting to formally adopt Jin as his son and therefore the future leader of Tsushima Island. We'll end up meeting up as well later on with Taka and Yuna to start off the tale that is getting into Yarikawa. We see that the city is under siege and we have to sneak into the city through an old way that both of them used to use when they were younger. Once inside, we end up coming across this guy whose name that I cannot tell you because I have no clue how to actually pronounce it. However, he is the leader of this area. He doesn't like us though because he was under the thumb of the Sakais and Shimuras after they attempted to do an uprising. He'll end up sending us on our way, and he doesn't want our help at all, and he believes that he can outlast the Mongols without us. We end up learning about some archers that need help, so we go off and do that, and with that, Taka ends up learning about how to actually take down Mongols. For a brief moment, you can see that Yuna is getting upset with Jin just because she's, seeing her brother go out and fight, and in this moment, it seems a bit odd to me that she's getting as frustrated as she is. I get why, because obviously she's very protective of her younger brother. However, I do think to an extent it is the case that it's just a bit overboard. He needs to learn how to fight if he's going to be in this sort of land. And again, like many other bits of emotion that I'm going to be discussing with you later on, so much of it just comes out of nowhere as if they just wanted an emotional moment. without the build-up necessary. As she doesn't seem to go over the top in other parts of the game, and even in this event, soon to come after this, she doesn't have an outburst at Jin either. And like I just said, it's as if they just wanted a more theatrical moment to, you know, make it feel as if there's a possible, you know, sort of form of relationship maybe going on there or whatnot, some form of contention that's happening to build up something. But again, this all leads to nothing. We end up meeting with the leader of the city yet again, and because we've got his archers back, he has become a little bit more friendly to us. We end up having a moment with Yuna at the top of the tower, getting drunk and just having a good conversation. After blacking out, we'll wake up and there is a siege that has just started. We will fight a load of enemies and take down a general who is yet again another faceless and with zero personality villain just shoved in there, and again, I don't know why none of the villains really have any form, or like even just main, you know, moments where you have to fight some form of boss. They just seem to have nothing about them. Within this moment, Jin is being put into a corner, and we unlock Ghost Mode, which feels incredibly badass. After killing tens of enemies with little issue, we have won the fight, and Jin gives a speech to embolden the people of Yarikawa. It will then take us again to Castle Shimura, Rizo, and also the Khan, having a conversation and finding out that they know that they need to kill Jin, as this is setting up to the final mission of the big final of Act 2. The next set of missions are truly outstanding. That is the best word that I can use to describe it. The next moments of this game allow us to dive deeper into the characters that clearly they want to show off. They clearly want us, the players, to see way more of their personalities, but at times the game does struggle to let us see that, as instead of allowing things to be far more talkative, allow people to ramble on or lore dump in different ways, they chose to strip this back quite a lot. However, within the next few missions, we get to see far more of the characters that we'll come to love. And I will be talking about the character development of these other characters. However, let's now dive back into the missions and talk about the next set. We will meet with Lord Shimura, and he has heard that Rizo is in the fort nearby. When Jin asks Yuna to join him to help him, she ends up believing that it's not her duty to do anymore. She has gained her passage to the mainland and wishes to take care of herself and Taka so that they can actually get there and have a different life. We'll leave for the fort, and in the cover of darkness we'll prepare our attack, but suddenly Taka comes over to us. He wants to help, so he acts as a distraction to draw away as many guards as possible from the main gate. Upon reaching the next set of doors, we find Rizo, who does one thing that is even more dishonourable than just doing what he's already done. He doesn't draw his blade at all, and instead uses his own men to take us down. We awake, tied to a pole. Taka is in front of us as well. We get to see a little bit more personality behind the man who is meant to be the main villain, and he keeps offering peace to Jin if he ends up joining the Khan. He even begins to taunt us about the name that Jin has gained, and ends up giving Taka his sword to kill him. The ultimatum is either to kill Jin and leave with his life, or die. Taka, walking slowly towards Jin, chooses to do what he believes is right. He turns around, attempting to strike the Khan. Sadly, it does not work out in his favour. The Khan uses our own sword to kill Taka, and with that tears off his head, which is probably one of the more brutal things you end up seeing in this game, and he is now, you know, dead. The Khan will then go on to tell us about how he didn't actually die for us. He died for an image that is us, aka the ghost. Once the Khan leaves, we'll take off our bindings and take down the remaining Straw Hats. Yuna will see us at the gate, and Jin keeps trying to change the conversation, which honestly I did think during this moment it was a bit of a dick move from him. Instead of just telling her what had happened and that, you know, taking her to Taka's body instead, that would have been miles better, but oh, he seems to just try and like make her go, oh no, come this way, let's go this way instead. After she sees that Taka has been monstrously killed, we end up fighting off all of the remaining Straw Hats to make sure that his body can be taken away from this fort and buried properly. After burying Taka, Yuna ends up blaming herself for all of what's happened, but realizes that what Jin is saying is true. This is the Mongols' doing, not hers, and now she has to join us and fight off the remaining ones and get rid of them from invading the island. This game will now enter into the final mission of Act 2, which is definitely the longest within the entire game. However, it was definitely worthwhile to play, as this is probably the hands down best mission set, depending on your belief around it, but in my opinion, considering you can't exit out of it and they try and act like it's multiple different missions blended into one and you can't exit out of it, it's all one mission. It's a very long mission, but it's absolutely amazing. We talk to some of our friends in the camp and then meet Shimura on top of the tower. He tells Jin that the request to adopt him as his heir has been accepted, and now we march off into battle. Through the gorgeous red trees, we ride into a devastated bit of land towards the gates of the castle. The ghost isn't here. We are Jin Sakai, the samurai, in this moment. We're locked out on one side of the castle, and we now need to choose a way to break in, and we climb over the walls. The Mongols are running away in fear after having witnessed their men dying of poison and Jin beheading their leader. As he does this though, the gates come flying open and Shimura isn't impressed. We head onwards anyway, and as our men are charging the last gates, horses come piling through on fire. The bridge gets destroyed, and with that, the final nail enters the coffin. Jin and Shimura are arguing over how to deal with the situation. Jin coming from a place of wanting to do it himself, deal with the enemy, and in the worst case, only one man has fallen instead of hundreds. In their disagreement, Shimura will smack Jin, and this truly is the actual nail in the coffin. The camel's back has been broken. Jin will then find Yuna and task her with getting some more wolfsbane poison so that it can be used against the Mongols, and also the ghost armor is then handed to us that Taka had created, which at first doesn't look that particularly good, but when upgraded it is a nice bit of kit. This brings us to probably one of the biggest stealth sequences in this game. We will parkour our way around the walls and sneak into the inner walls. Sneaking around using the rope and long grass, we'll make our way over to where their drinking supply is in the camp and, start poisoning it. We wait and they all start to fall, dying and spitting out blood. We then come to fight Rizo, who tries to reason with Jin and says that he could become a double agent. After he refuses to turn himself in for the crimes that he has committed, the final duel between the two of them begins, which I found this one absurdly easy. Or at least for me it was, because I came into this mission, because you're doing so much stealth, with maxed out everything, which means that I could use every single ability and take him down in a matter of seconds, not minutes. Jin will walk down the steps and he will see Lord Shimura and also Yuna. He'll hand over the castle to Shimura because obviously it's his, being told by his uncle though that he needs to blame Yuna for his actions and claim his spot as his heir. Jin ends up handing himself in as he knows what he has done is dishonourable to the samurai code. Now in confinement, we finish Act 2 and enter into Act 3. What I do find quite funny is that there's always this sort of mission in every single open world. Around about middle-ish of the game, we end up coming across a moment where we get stripped of everything we have and we're put in prison. I feel like it's kind of gaming's equivalent of like what movies and shows do, where they don't know how to progress the plot in any way, so what they do instead is they just kill off a character so that it can progress it in some drastic manner, whereas in games it's like, we're gonna just strip you of all of your things and make you see how far you've come, but in doing so we can now push the plot off into this other direction that it wasn't necessarily going to go into originally. It's something that once you pick up on it, these sorts of cliches, you end up picking up on it all the time. This has been a thing in gaming for over a decade, if not probably longer than just 1 decade. Jin will wake from a few days of being imprisoned. Kenji will show up and he comes to help Jin out and tells him that he needs to escape, otherwise he'll be sent to the mainland for punishment. So we sneak out, we make our way to our horse, and we start to flee. However, Nobu will take 3 arrows. He tries his best, but he does end up collapsing. We would never end up being able to go on that final peaceful ride with Nobu. This moment genuinely upset me. I was actually fairly sad and down after this, as I really liked our horse. It's one of the few games that have ever made me actually care about our horse. Only in my second playthrough of Red Dead 2 did I even start to care about my horse, let alone like the first playthrough. I didn't overly care too much, whereas this game does a really good job of making you genuinely care, and it felt like you lost a dear friend within this moment. After burying Nobu, we'll head to the village that is on fire just in the distance. We have no weapons, so we'll sneak past all of the Mongols, and when we can, we make it to the big tree at the heart of the village where we find bodies. But there are no wounds. Jin will realise the true consequence of using the poison wasn't the disapproval of his uncle and possible execution, but the damage the Mongols might do now that they know of the existence of this poison. Jin will then wake up and Yuna is there. In my opinion, this did feel a little bit weak. It just kind of happens to push the story along as if it was just designed originally to be something else. It was really odd. It just kind of like, oh, he just faints and then there's soldiers all around him, but then, oh, you're now in a tent with Yuna and it's all good. We ride to a temple and use some explosions and we'll rescue the captives, but once the fighting is over, we'll end up finding our new home base for the moment within this final act of the game. We'll end up meeting some men on the top of the mountain and will then eventually be joined by our companions. I have to say, on a rewatch of this gameplay, this mission really feels like a really filler mission. It only serves one main narrative purpose, which is to just bring together Jin and his companions, but gameplay wise and reasoning, it just felt as if they were like, oh yeah, the gameplay, we need to make this big fort for an action piece, but then again, like, the action piece itself made no sense. Why did everyone just turn up? We will talk to Yuna yet again and be transported to Port Izmi. We'll speak to Yuna on top of the lighthouse and get a better look at where the Khan is, making his last stand before he starts to attack the mainland. Before making it to the top, they find poison and realize his plan is to use it on the mainland and take down the Shogun with no issue, as they'll all be struggling to stay alive. We'll then plan our attack, and now we're heading back to the temple. This adds to that feeling that Act 3 is incredibly short and overly fast, and this is because it is. Act 3 of this game is incredibly quick. We end up getting teleported back, however, we actually have one cool mission to finish off the game just before the final fight to take on the Khan, which is to sneak into the same fort we ran away from and escaped. We end up getting to choose a new horse. This time I went with the jet black option and named him Shadow. He never ended up feeling like Nobu though. After riding for a while, we make it to Shimura's castle. We'll sneak in and leave the letter. This mission was really cool as a concept, but as we know, the stakes are risen far more, and if we're honest, it just felt as if this was like a final moment before the game is meant to go into its like final extreme, and it's just like a mission to just kind of go, oh, quickly have this in here because it's cool to do, and it just takes the pacing of like this ramp up to, oh, he's gonna leave, go to the mainland. It's like, oh no, real quick, let me go sneak into this castle and it'll be fine. It just felt a little bit off. We'll meet with Yuna and we'll talk with all of our companions. One last bit of silence before the storm to come. We have started our plans and will begin our assault on the Khan's forces. And we end up making it directly to the Khan, face to face once again. He has his whole armor set on and he'll continue to tell us the same stuff he's told us the whole time. This was the best fight in the entire game by miles. Only with the DLC boss being a little bit better. Actually, let's just rephrase that because I didn't script this bit until later. The DLC boss is way better, but this is the best one within the base game. I wish we had more like it, as we did end up jumping between like a couple of fighting styles in this, but it wasn't the same way as the DLC. The Khan will then make a run for it. He runs over to the boat, and we have to take on his forces and eventually him as well at the same time. Jin will, in this moment that ends up feeling amazing, he chooses to behead the Khan and he ends up having to jump off the ship. Yuna will find him coming out of the water, and for a moment I thought this was going to end up being again some like relationship building thing, but it just doesn't and it closes off. Jin's uncle has sent him a letter asking him to meet in a place that they both know very well. They stand face to face once more. Shimura tells Jin that he no longer is a samurai and that his clan is no more. They will make it to his father's grave, which gives us a great scene.
I will miss this.
So will I. The Shogun has declared you a traitor.
He ordered you to kill me.
The Ghost was an outlaw. He taught our people to defy their leaders.
To defend themselves.
With poison. A gift you gave to our enemy.
I had to stop you from throwing away our people's lives.
You have no honor.
And you are a slave to it.
You are my son.
Now I must continue the line of Shimura without you. I must start a new family, and my head is the cost. Taking it is my punishment.
Our final day together. It is beautiful. It's time. Write the last words of Clan Sakai.
And Clan Shimura.
After this scene, we will end up fighting and will be given the only big choice in this game. Do we let Shimura live or kill him? I chose to spare him. I was really on the edge of just giving him a warrior's death and then killing him as, you know, for revenge for Nobu's death. But if I'm honest, I then chose not to do it, and I don't really know why. With that, the credits roll, and we can now discuss the story in the way that I truly want to. The first thing that I really enjoyed about this game is the inner conflict of Jin Sakai between the samurai that he is meant to be versus the ghost that he has to be. Throughout this game, this is the most obvious fight. One that doesn't really seem to be too much of an actual inner conflict, especially after the first act. However, it is one that isn't within his own purview, but within others. Is the ghost worthwhile? Does it actually help achieve the goal of getting rid of his enemies? Or does it actually dishonor and bring change on his own people as an action that is taken to disrupt the status quo of what it means to be a samurai? This is a part of the game that is truly amazing, as we get to see a proper struggle between the person Jin has to be to save his home versus the person that he grew up to be. I'll dive deeper into this and the lessons that we can learn around it in a moment. I felt like Yuna's relationship with Jin was really interesting. Originally, I did feel as if us, the players, had been cheated slightly, as it definitely came across at times as if it was trying to build some form of romantic connection between the two characters throughout the entire story. However, this doesn't come to fruition. Over time though, and on reflection, I actually liked this. It's a part of the game's way of going against the typical norms that most games would play off of, which can work well. However, at some points it does become a tad exhausting. With this though, I do think it does leave enough open room for a possibility of a build up in a second game, which we will get into later on, because obviously when I was scripting this, as per every single thing that I do when it comes to video creation, something else happens that then rocks how I have to talk about the script. So I scripted this before the second game was announced, so sorry about that. But yeah, if there was a second game, there could have been a build up to it, if there was one for Jin's character, I mean. Generally speaking though, I do believe that this game does a great job of showing this gained feeling for each other, not necessarily through a relationship lens, but through a lens of just mutual appreciation for each other. Yuna wouldn't have been able to get the revenge for many different things that happen within this game if it wasn't for Jin. However, also, if it wasn't for Yuna, Jin would be dead, and it would be the case that the Mongols would still be on Tsushima Island and would have just gone over to the mainland. The last of the three big things that I really liked about the story is the Khan. He's actually made out to be a smart villain. He is definitely not a good guy, or even in any right state of mind looked at to be one. He doesn't have any righteous reason for doing what he's doing. He is instead evil, but he is cunning and calculated. I really like that. However, I do wish that we got more time with him so that it could actually develop the idea and actually listen to what he wants to do and learn more about his character instead of just being like the bad guy for bad guy's sake. Let's talk about some of the things that I didn't like. The first is going to be Rizzo, and specifically how this game handles the betrayal of his character. I was expecting this to happen, as it was one of the most typical tropes that could happen in this style of game. In this game though, I do feel as if it was a tad rushed. It didn't seem as if they actually wanted to spend much time building his character up and having that betrayal have a deep impact. Instead, they just wanted to have it happen for the sake of it happening. For starters, we didn't really get to see much of his character. We could have at least had another 3 or so missions with him. However, the biggest issue for me isn't even that, it's the fact that he wasn't even likable in the first place. We saw this a lot with Assassin's Creed Valhalla as well, but this game is also indulging into the same issue. Rizzo is just simply unlikable. I don't ever see at any point in this game any indication that these two were truly friends. None of the conversations, whether or not it's about the present or the past, come across as if they were friendly in any way. If anything, it seems like they were childhood rivals all the way through, and it just built a resentment on Rizzo's end, and nothing more than that. It doesn't ever come across in any way like these two were friendly. The next thing that I didn't like about this game is that once Jin has become an outlaw and is pretty much sentenced to death by the Shogun, why isn't there any missions where they're trying to get Jin again or just hunt him down? You know, like, it doesn't have to end in him wanting to kill them or anything, but like, why do they just seem not bothered? They don't care too much. It felt like we became an outlaw and nothing really happened as a consequence for this happening. I don't know if this was just overlooked or because they did what most Act 3s do in most games, which is they just rush the hell out of it so that it kind of builds up to this big ending moment. But because of all of this, it just never really felt as if we were an outlaw, as you can basically go and do all of the same stuff after like a couple of missions anyway. You just can't go into a couple of castles. Talking about this subject and Jin being in exile, why is it that within just a few missions of Act 3 is he then able to travel back down south? For the first few missions, you're not able to, and this makes complete sense. In theory, the samurai wouldn't have just let Jin roam around Tsushima Island as much as he likes, purely because, you know, he's an enemy of the Shogun now, and it makes complete sense as to how Act 3 was as quick as it was. However, again, they just kind of lift this blanket ban after like an hour. However, for no apparent reason, he can now just travel south. It seemed like another thing to make players feel as if they had freedom, but also force them into the first few missions of Act 3 as if they weren't having it. It was as if they just couldn't make up their mind. Which in my opinion is an absolutely awful move by Sucker Punch. Why on earth would they make it so that in Act 3, where the momentum is meant to be building as much as it should be, they just go, hey, here you go, we're just gonna drop it. Because if you're gonna have a high stakes environment in any way, whether it's in movies or books or shows in games, you shouldn't just slow it down because you want to take the plot elsewhere for a moment. We ended up seeing how this went down firsthand when it came to The Last of Us Part 2. No matter your opinion of the game, fundamentally, the plot was whatever you want to think about it. When it comes to the pacing, however, it was very much a just up and down cycle. It would ramp up and then just drop. It would ramp up, just drop. And that's not good. It makes the game exhausting to play through, and this wasn't any different for me. The biggest flaw that I've seen pointed out, and I realised nearing the end of this game, is the lack of choice this game gives to you. What I mean by the lack of choice is the ability to impact the story. We only get one big choice right at the end, and honestly, I wasn't expecting that to be the case. Now, is this kind of my fault? Yes. A member in the Discord said to me, am I looking to play an honourable playthrough or go stealth? And I took that to an extent to mean something kind of similar to, let's say, a Dishonored or a Red Dead 2, having a different ending or different style of ending based on your actions within the game. Finding out that your choices that you make in-game really make no difference to the outcome of the story was kind of disappointing. I wish that they at least made an effort to at least have your own impact as the player have some form of impact on the story in the later game. My final and biggest gripe with this game's story is that they take the idea of show don't tell to an extreme. They don't like telling you pretty much anything. They would rather you just ride in silence and just hold a really same old conversation with the same person for the 10th time. Those were the biggest pet peeves or just issues for this game. And I do really like this game, even though it may not sound like it right now. So instead, let's now spend some time talking about the lessons that you can take away from this story.
You have no honor, and you are a slave to it.
This scene is the big one. It's the one that you're going to see everywhere on the likes of YouTube and TikTok and Instagram Reels whenever anything massively stoic is being said in a gaming context. And simply put, the reason for this, and the same reason that I absolutely love it, is that everyone loves it. It ends up encapsulating the entire story of this game in just 11 words. And it's truly just a beautiful moment that ends up wrapping up the entire present that is Ghost of Tsushima's story. This isn't just a question around people being honourable, or whether it's actually good to be honourable. It's a question of, can people take it too far? This isn't a new concept by any means. Humanity has been plagued by this question of, do we do the right thing or what's necessary, and typically whichever side does win, it's normally the latter, at least in the short term. The most obvious example of this in recent history, and shown off wonderfully in the movie Oppenheimer, is the creation of the atomic bombs. As put in that movie, they were in a race against the Nazis, and they knew that at the very least they couldn't trust Hitler with the power of destroying the world. This led to eventually making the atomic bomb, even after the defeat of Germany. So which side is considered more morally righteous? Which isn't me asking you that question, I'm just stating and displaying to us what history has shown us. This is yet another example of whether or not we should create this massive thing that's going to destroy us all, or whether or not we should keep it in the bottle and waiting for possibly our enemy to end up having the same power, just using it on us instead of us being able to use it on them. However, the genie in a bottle analogy is used in this game in terms of how the poison is used, the same way that it gets used heavily when it comes to people talking about the idea of nuclear weapons. This game is asking us the question and shows us, the player, that at times we must defy what is good, honourable and the right thing for the greater good. It's in a way similar to how Metal Gear games make you question the choices of war, whereas this game opens you up to the idea that sometimes brutal tactics must be used in order to defeat a brutal opponent. This game shows this off perfectly with the Khan. We get to see how intelligent he is, knowing how the samurai will react, and in turn end up losing one of their greatest soldiers right at the beginning of the game, and then eventually losing over 99% of Tsushima Island. By following the honourable, supposedly righteous path, it led to the deaths of many who didn't need to die. We get to see this on display yet again when we take Shimura's castle. Shimura, wanting us to do what he believed was right, was willing to send samurais to die, just so that he could say that he didn't become like the enemy. At what point do you ask yourself the question, is the survival of you and your people worth more than moral virtue? It's not just a story about being honourable or not, killing people with stealth or upfront. It's a story about morality, when morality can then slip at the cost of nothing more than becoming someone who's not as bad as the bad guy, but not as good as you once were. This is a story about where that line is drawn. Do we cross it for the sake of salvation, or do we accept what has happened and live in fear for the rest of our lives? The other story that is effectively intertwined with what I've been discussing is Jin accepting who he has to become, not who he was meant to be or who he was told to be. He embodies a lot of the same characteristics of many of us. We grow up with a set of expectations and values that we adhere to, some good, some stupid, but we feel the need to adhere to them nonetheless. We'll question ourselves at times. When we end up making a decision that is right for us, or the family we're starting, or the relationship that we're in. However, if any of those ideals go against the ones that we were raised with, it will cause continuous self-doubt. Jin in this story becomes who he needs to be, which is the Ghost. He is the phantom that makes his enemies run in fear and is the only reason his homeland is safe. He is the video game embodiment of doing what is needed, not what was expected of him. He does what is for the betterment of his people, not the people who raised him. You could end up looking at this action through a selfish perspective, or you could end up looking at it more through the perspective of trying to do what is necessary, but in the process becoming the enemy that you were trying to defeat. All three big ideas of this game, the samurai versus the ghost, poison versus letting the genie out of the bottle, and being more than who you were raised to be, are the three main themes that are running rampant over this story. Even if not blatantly obvious at times, but they still exist, and are there to show the player that the right thing isn't necessarily always going to be the option that is best for you, and also isn't always going to be the move that you need to take in order to move forward. It teaches the player that you are more than just the set of characteristics that you are given at birth and the belief systems that you inherit in early childhood. It also teaches you that games can have far more impact than what you may think on a surface level once you start to peel back some of those layers. Let's now spend some time though talking about the side content, which I'm going to go about it in a individualistic sense, so I'm going to go between each one as they go. Unlike the story, I'm not going to be giving a detailed rundown as to what happens in every single side mission. However, I'm just going to give you a general summary and then talk about what I didn't like and what I did like. Firstly, to discuss the side content, I need to talk about my biggest issue with the side content, which is making a normal side mission feel like nothing at all. Most of the side characters will have around 3 missions in each act, or at least the important ones do. However, when I think about side missions, I normally think about them in 2 buckets of side content. The first is your smash and grabs, the easy dopamine hits, the collectible grind. Those sorts of side missions are normally there to just be filler. That is why they exist. The other are lore-rich and story-driven moments within the game that can at times outshine the experience of the main story. Maybe open you up to the side of the protagonist that you hadn't seen in your main playthrough. However, this game chooses to get rid of both and insert some weird hybrid. This hybrid is missions that feel like they can take up to 10 minutes on the high end and 3 to 4 minutes on the low end. They rarely deep dive into characters or let Jin have any more emotional range than he does within the main story. It all seems really surface level and lacks any substance to the structure of these missions. I really like Yuna's side missions, but outside of this, the rest felt like they were lacking something, or multiple things. The missions themselves can be summarized as followed. Talk to the side character, go to location where you're either going to ambush the enemy or they're going to ambush you. Now take a break and talk to that same person at this new location. Now go to another location where you are going to ambush someone or be ambushed yet again. The formula of these side missions becomes incredibly repetitive, with some deviating either by forcing stealth, such as Yuna's side missions, which actually felt unique, or they might have you do a boss battle that makes you feel like you can take a break from the typical hack and slash moments of its combat system. Due to the mission length as well, it really makes them feel like they're not really side missions, just half-sized side missions. Personally, I would have rather had them so that instead of them being 9 side missions per, let's say, the main set of characters, you at least got them in the length of 12 of these missions, but they were broken up into 3 or 4, so that way you actually have longer length side missions that make you feel as if you're spending a decent amount of time with the character instead of, just running around for the sake of it, kill 3 Ronin here, sneak into a camp there, kill 1 guy and then call it a day. What this all comes at the cost of is that you end up having to put so much pressure on the narratives of these side missions, or you just have to hope that players are happy with your junk food filler side content. Sadly, in the majority of cases, I felt as if most of the side content didn't really make sense and at times just took the entire idea of defying norms to the extreme. So let's actually talk about them. I'm going to now start talking about Lady Masako. Her quests will follow her on her revenge path against the people who killed her whole family. You'll have her tie in with the narrative as her sons and husband die in battle in the intro of the game, but also someone or a group of people have killed the rest of her family. I found this to be the most disappointing side mission by far. Not only is it incredibly repetitive, but outright absurd at points. It's as if they just caricatured someone who's dealing with grief and just went, here you go, this is what we're going to display to the people. Not only that, but they rarely ever let the player in on what's going on most of the time within her own missions. What you'll end up noticing within the missions with Masako is that so many of them are all about finding any form of clue as to who murdered her family. Almost all of it is just following someone or going to a location where someone is meant to be, thinking that they're a part of this massive conspiracy to kill her family, and then you find out they're either just nothing to do with it, or they might have had something to do with it, but it was so small that it didn't even matter us going and doing it, and it just repeats doing this over and over again. It's as if they wanted to have a childish version of a detective show. I know that this is some extreme level of complaining, but I feel as if it's valid criticism to make. As by the time I got to the final 3 missions, I was just getting fed up with this entire story. I was also getting fed up with her character. She would just keep going off, doing her own thing, doing everything without Jin or really telling him much about what was happening, and it just became repetitive and boring. Then when we have the only lead in her entire set of missions, she chooses to then turn on Jin. I can understand her being blinded by revenge, however, it just felt incredibly random. Even though I did find this random, it doesn't necessarily mean that I thought it was an awful thing for them to do. I actually quite liked the fight between them, the dialogue and whatnot. The fight itself was also pretty fun. This all brings me to the ending, which I did feel as if it kind of just gets there really quickly without much reason. She's basically gone mad by this point, and almost every single mission with her, like 8 out of the 9 of them, we're going on goose chases to try and find out her family's killer. We then find them in the last mission with no real build-up, and then bam, it's done. That's the entire side mission. Editor Adam here, and I just wanted to add into this that when I'm talking about this in particular, I'm talking about the Fisherman's Hut, these sorts of things. I'm not discussing necessarily the actual full ending where you end up meeting, you know, her sister and finding out she's the reason behind it. Even so, I do still think my point stands about the fact that it kind of just all builds up, it's then collectively just snap done, everything's done, and then it's just like, oh yeah, it's the sister, and it's like, okay, cool, that like none of this really has been built up. I get that it's been a grand conspiracy sort of thing to try and figure out who killed her family, but still, overall, I don't think it was necessarily that interesting, nor do I think it was really done particularly well. This was an issue that I had with the main story of AC Mirage, as we would go around doing things, not really knowing anything about it, and then boom, out of nowhere, we'd end up getting a massive lore dump. Let's talk about the side mission though that I actually liked a decent amount, which was Ishwakada's. His story is actually full of mystery and intrigue that is done in the correct way, and even the ending, it defies the expectation that I had originally. However, I wasn't there scratching my head questioning why they chose to take this direction. At first, I didn't know how to feel about it. It seemed really interesting though, and it was able to keep that intrigue going throughout the entire thing. I was coming up with my own theories as to who Tomoe was to Ishwakada. As things started to progress, I came to my own conclusions as to why he might have been, you know, interested in her as a character. Maybe it was because he was actually her father, but she was born to a low-class woman, and because of this, it meant that he couldn't raise her herself. But then, as it went on, the story was able to defy my own expectations for what was actually happening, and it actually felt like it was threading the needle on both sides of this idea. The first is that he clearly values her as a student, and for her skills with the bow. He has an admiration for her, and she has one for him, as we later see within this questline. You can clearly see that he has an admiration for her and the skills that she has, but you can also see that he wants something that is not necessarily a student and, you know, teacher dynamic, but also not a lover dynamic. It seems more like a fatherly idea. The missions themselves do become a little bit repetitive, but nowhere near to the same extent as Masako's ones. We actually end up getting closer and closer to Tomoe, and we end up learning far more about her character. We get genuine lore and backstory to her throughout this entire mission, and it's actually done really well, and it ends up reflecting onto how Jin is treated by Ishwakada as well. I did find it a little strange that the archer who supposedly turned to a different side and was training loads of these Mongols up, you never find them outside of their missions or traveling freely. It's only within the mission design itself. However, I will let it go, as this is more of a video game thing, I guess is the best way of describing it. You also get one trope more common nowadays, which is, you know, having the enemy that in this case is Tomoe, but she isn't necessarily a bad person or an evil person. We actually get to spend some time with Tomoe in the last few missions, and she seems like a relatively nice person, and generally speaking, only ends up making this mistake and jumping ship due to her mentor being overbearing and just having an over-the-top expectation as to how she should be. And obviously, if this never happened and Ishwakada wasn't so overbearing, she would have been an exceptional ally within the game's story. The story in this side mission, though, does show that not all bad people are naturally bad. They can sometimes be pushed due to negative teachings in this case, which I really do like the premise of as a side mission. The ending in itself, though, I did find a little bit odd. I would have rather it be done in a way that had some form of symbolic moment of bread breaking between the two characters and seeing them actually helping each other out, maybe having Tomoe help us in the final fight. Even with that taken into account though, one thing that I do like about this mission is that it's not a negative ending, unlike the majority of this game's story. Let's now talk about the character that I would refer to as a form of bumbling idiot, which is Kenji. I actually really liked his character and the general takeaway of his story. However, I did feel at times they were leaning a bit too much into the idea of him being some form of comic relief character that just felt a little bit off, especially when this game's tone is generally very serious. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing for games to have a form of comic relief, however, I do think it just felt a little bit out of place. In this game, he's used primarily as a punching bag for jabs to be thrown at every now and again that's meant to be funny, but most of the time just isn't really that amusing. What I would say about this character's arc, however, is that I think it's actually a really great story that teaches people the lesson that just because you do one thing a certain way, it doesn't have to be the case that you do this forever. It's effectively this game's story of someone who's gone to jail or maybe was an alcoholic at one point, but they turn their life around, they start teaching others and are able to help people with the methods that they used that may have been questionable in their past so that it better helps society. I was a fan of the character arc that Kenji goes through, however at times I was struggling to emotionally just engage with his character, considering throughout most of the story he is nothing more than that comic relief character. Norio is now next up on the chopping block, which isn't going to help anyone's perspective of me hating this game now because of its side content. My first takeaway when playing through this character's side missions was that they were just awfully hard to care about in any way. Nothing about them made me want to care about this character's story or the journey that he was going on. It didn't have much mystery to it and typically was nothing more than just go here and defend this. The narrative for this character was nearly non-existent, and I think a partial reason for this issue is that, or at least my issue with this, is that it came in within the second part of the game and was a little bit late for the amount of missions that you're going to be doing with this character, whereas if it was a little bit earlier with let's say Ishwakada or Masako, it may have been a tad bit more interesting. As for both of those, they at least end up having you build up some level of rapport. However, I don't necessarily know if this would have been the answer to this issue, as there is characters that you end up only doing primary loads of side content with and one really dominant character that you learn about only in the secondary part of this game that has really good side content and you come to genuinely like and have a deepened relationship with, and it's done in the right way. Versus this, where there was just a problem for me to even emotionally engage with his character. What this story does though is another moment like Masako, where it just goes from 0 to 100 and this time it's even more out of character. The whole way through Norio's questline, we can see that he's a little bit more combative than, the other monks that we end up meeting. Again though, like others, this does make sense for his background. However, the last mission, he just goes off the rails with very little reason and it's never built up in any way. Out of nowhere, he just goes ballistic. To give some background, within this final mission, Norio will ask Jin to join him as he's found the Mongol leader who ended up killing his brother. In this moment, we agree to just sleep and then attack in the next day. What happens though? We wake up and the village that we're meant to be attacking is on fire, and as we walk in, he is burning people alive. Norio is there telling us how he was just overcome by rage. Which I'm sorry, if you're going to have a moment like this, it needs to be built up or at least have something like a fight happening. Have Jin try and explain to him how this is bad and then it builds to a fight between these two, showing one side with Norio of what happens when a person is nothing more than hatred versus Jin who has dealt with his own problems but reflects and tries to deal with them personally. That would have been better in my opinion at least with the end of this story. This though is just another example as to how this game struggles massively with telling stories on the side. It was as if they wanted this character's story to end badly or with a sour taste in our mouths, so instead of them, doing anything that comes to that natural conclusion where he might have ended up being really aggressive, so instead they just kind of go, oh, we're just going to throw a spanner in the works and make you just questioning what our ability is in terms of storytelling. Now for the second best piece of side content in my opinion, we have Yuriko. This quest will take us back to Jin's past by reminiscing with that exact past with Yuriko, who is kind of like a housemaid, I guess, to the family that is Clan Sakai. However, there is little details brought up and then kind of finalized by the end of her missions is that she had a massive love for Jin's father. She is blatantly dealing with some form of dementia as well. Jin in the end will just pretend to be his father as she keeps mistaking him for his father. Now this is the sort of side mission we need way more of within this game. Like I said earlier, there is two primary types of side mission. The junk food, fast, smash and grab ones that are just there to just fill up time, and the others that are meant to enrich the story of the character you're playing or the world you're exploring. And this is an example of exactly that. It tells a beautiful story that many people will be able to relate to, as so many people in the modern day deal with the exact same issue as what we're dealing with within this game. We're able to relate to the story, which is one of its amazing aspects, that many stories within this game just struggle to do because it's hard to relate to these characters when they're going off the walls and their examples don't really make sense. We need to feel something and emotionally connect to them. Is there flaws in these missions? Only small ones for me, such as having the need for combat with within these moments just felt a little bit unnecessary. I would have rather just had it been a conversation on horseback whilst collecting goods rather than dealing with Mongols, bandits or straw hats from time to time. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that the missions themselves are bad. It just shows that the gameplay design of this game acts as if they know that the players can't deal with like more than 5 minutes of no action taking place. Otherwise, they just have to throw it in there and make us aware that this game has action. Please, guys, don't throw away our game. It's one of those things where Red Dead 2 excels in this because it allows you to sit with these characters, just hearing their stories and having the world talk to you, having the world explain to you in a way that actually feels like a genuine conversation, instead of how this game approaches it, where they just decide, hey, instead of you being able to handle a genuine deep conversation for 10 minutes, we're going to just throw in a few different moments of action because it has to happen, only because we think that you guys have awful attention spans. Yuna for me had the best side missions. Not because anything in them was dramatically amazing, however, I think that this was the example of what a mission in games should be, especially side content. They should have some level of emotional depth, either for the main protagonist or the character that you're sharing that story with, or helping build up the world that you are within. This game, luckily, does at least 3 out of those 4. It's also shorter than most. It's short and sweet, which is basically the best way to explain this set of missions. What I'm talking about in particular is her quest around the slavers. This side mission allows us to get a glimpse into the world that we are within. The horrors faced, the lack of humanity on some fronts, the willingness to turn a blind eye, and far more. It's truly great in that manner, and to put the cherry on top, it forces us to do stealth. This may be something that you don't like, but personally, for me, this is one of the excellent parts of this game. It meant that I couldn't just run in guns blazing, and if I did make a mistake, I couldn't just rely on the combat. It meant that I actually had to be stealthy and find the killers without being blatantly shown who I was targeting. I'm unsure of why this was an intentional decision to see if maybe players liked it. That could be my only guess, maybe testing it out to see if it's something to put into the next game, but for me, this mission stands out by far as one of the most engaging ones of them all. The last bit of side content that I genuinely wish we spent way more time with, but don't actually have any dedicated side content for, is Lord Chimera. I felt like this was one of the areas of the game that it lacked greatly. It was either a lack of not letting us spend as much time as we should have with this character to build up that relationship between Jin and Chimera, or it was just the case that fundamentally they couldn't be asked to put it in the game. It's genuinely sad to see, as this could have built up the ending far more. The reason that I say this is that their relationship exists, however, it doesn't at all feel that emotional. To me, it felt really wooden and stiff. It didn't really have much, laughter or joy going on at any moments. I understand that under the circumstances, they wouldn't be exactly laughing, but, it just seems a little bit less like a family or father-son dynamic and more like a I'm telling you what to do and you will do as you're told sort of dynamic. And it ends up staying the same way all the way through the game, all the way to its final moments. Are there bits that are kind gestures? Definitely. However, I think the ending choice would have been far better if we had actually spent more time with his character. I would rather have been able to do something like hunting together, investigating into a spy among the ranks, or anything that's more closer to home as an experience that they can then share together that exemplifies their relationship far more. The reason that I put so much emphasis on these characters and their stories and how it has to impact the world that they exist in or deepen our connection to Jin as a character is because this game has plenty of other side content, very stereotypical filler content. It has those typical smash and grabs that this game is meant to have. Most games are meant to just give us some bit of filler in there so that we can have something else on the side that's not really deep and really serious. However, this game does seem to shy away from wanting to give us stuff that enriches the character and teaches us more about Jin Sakai and shows us more that could develop his character later on. Instead, they choose to opt for, very generally speaking, mediocre side missions. Let's talk about some lessons though the game wants us to take away from its side content and general story, just to expand upon what I was talking about a moment ago. And this section is going to be specifically about how this game defies many different norms. However, I do believe it is done to an extreme end that ends up becoming far more predictable than it is anything else. What I mean by the biggest primary norm that they are breaking within this game is that nobody, almost nobody anyway, has a good ending. Nothing at all. No good endings besides maybe Kenji and Ishwakada. All the other characters have an awful time and bad endings. This game's lesson, I guess, and the takeaway you could take from this is that in war, nobody gets a good ending. Next to nothing good comes from war is the idea I believe this game is at least trying to convey, even if it's not saying it blatantly. What this does for the game is that it leans into this idea of keeping the players on their toes so that they don't know what's coming next. What this quest could end up leading to, we don't know, or what's coming next is something that we, generally speaking, can't really predict overly well with this story. However, the bad side of this is that once this becomes the easy thing that they keep doing over and over again, it becomes more and more predictable, which means that you may not be able to guess exactly what happens, but you definitely know it's not going to be a happy ending for the most part. If no one has a good ending and nothing seems to work out somewhat okay, then the endings of each character become incredibly easy to guess. In this game's case, they're either going to die or become so fueled by rage that they become every single monster that they wish to defeat. By defying norms, I think this game is able to push itself into a unique position storytelling wise. It opens up the players' minds to what people may think, when they've seen war movies or shows or anything that displays battles that can look absolutely badass or as if the hero is this next level human, but fundamentally, these fights only end in misery for anyone involved. It allows the game to play with many themes that rarely get tackled. The most notable series of tackling these sorts of issues anyway is Metal Gear Solid. So having a game like this allows people to see the brutality and effects on the everyday people that something like war could have, which is cool to see as a thing that they're just trying to display in a game. The game itself is a depressing experience, and once you realize this truth, it becomes far more easy to see. It ends up becoming predictable, but at the cost of being unique. We've finally reached the point in this video where I'm not going to be talking about the story or its side content, and I'm going to stop being the English teacher that everyone hated during school when it came to overanalyzing everything, and instead talk about the gameplay. I wanted to start off this section by discussing how this game does an amazing job at how they handle power creep and giving the player better feelings of power and as if they're becoming the ultimate samurai. Unless you're trying to get everything within the first act before processing then into Act 2 and then again into Act 3, then you're going to find yourself feeling adequately matched to fight any enemy in front of you. You can slowly upgrade your toolkit, getting access to better stuff as the game goes on. You'll find out about new abilities, whether this is from the upgrades in your skill tree or quests about warriors from the past. This game does a really good job of not making you feel overpowered, at least for the first half of its runtime. I do think the ghost ability, for as cool as it is and as badass as it makes us feel, is a tad overpowered at times. Then again, you can only use it against 3 enemies. The game is able to present itself in a way that gives us progression and doesn't make us feel as if we are just steamrolling through every single person. Sometimes it can feel like it, especially when you have a full set of everything and you go into a boss fight, they become incredibly easy. This though doesn't happen enough for it to become a regular issue, which might sound dumb to call an issue, but I classify this as such due to the fact that it takes away from the experience that you're meant to be having. Generally, this game does a great job at handling power creep and making us feel as if we are becoming powerful over time. We never at any point typically end up feeling as if we've become really powerful really quickly with no real explanation as to why. To start off anything related to the combat, we need to first talk about the sword fighting, as this is truly an area of the game that gets a ton of love and that loads of people love about this game overall is the way that it handles its combat system and the sword fighting mechanics. With Ghost of Tsushima, we have 4 fighting styles: stone, moon, water, and wind. All 4 are designed to help us against particular enemy types, allowing us to dispatch enemies with ease once we know how to actually dedicate our time in the right stance and how to use them effectively. This is a rather unique feature for a game of this style. Most games will give you an option to, just have weapon variety, which normally just affects 2 things, which is just damage and speed. This though allows us to truly feel like a master of the katana. We get to use sweeping attacks to take down enemies that are big and brutish, or to allow us to get access into fighting spear users. This game exemplifies the idea of feeling like a true samurai. With this system, it's also able to help build up the feeling of power and competency as we continue playing. It doesn't feel like we're just magically far more powerful than we should be. Personally, I spent a lot of time either in the stone or water stance, as I found the general combos far more accessible for the broader spectrum of enemies that you're fighting, as it gave me a good range against a wider variety of opponents. With the other two coming in need when they were needed, for either spearmen or brutes. The stone stance has a good progression, but a very standard one at that, which isn't going to be a surprise considering it's a basic fighting style. We get a decent amount of progression with each, but the one that stands out the most for me is wind, for having the feeling as if you are actually getting improvements. My favourite combo was the ability to shield break and do loads of damage in a short period of time with loads of slashes through the water stance. It became a part of my go-to, especially for boss battles. What I will say though as a negative for the system, however, is that I do feel as if to a degree it limited and held back a little bit of its potential when they could have, gone a bit further with it. I don't know whether or not it's just because this game was the first in the Ghost franchise, I guess is the name for it now, or if it's just because the development team wanted to implement it in this way, but at times it does feel as if they didn't really want to flesh out the combat system in the way that I kind of feel like they could have done, but they chose to reserve themselves in doing so. Yes, it's far more than most games out there. However, I did find 4 upgrades in each stance a little bit lacking in feeling powerful, or as if something new had truly been added besides a very few limited amount of aspects. I really love the combat system, and I would have loved it even more if maybe we were able to branch out further into the sections that we were actually progressing within. But also if things like charms just did a little bit more than what they do currently, which is primarily just stat buffs with some unique things being added in there from time to time. Most of the time though, you'll hardly notice an effect with the charms that are being added. It was as if they wanted to have more loot available, but knew that they couldn't give a samurai a short sword or a mace, so they just added a ton of charms so that they could get around this issue, which to me caused an even bigger issue, and it's something that I have an issue with when it comes to most open world games out there, which is an overabundance of items to collect that typically do nothing. I at least don't mind it in games like Skyrim, Fallout, or The Witcher, when you're just picking up random objects that are inside a house. That's fine. But when it's a game like this, where it's just a load of charm slots that they all just kind of blur together, or a game like Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Origins or Valhalla, where actually not Valhalla. Valhalla's credit, it didn't have this feature, but with the other two, just the overabundance of the same sort of thing, just with a different stat buff. That isn't for this part of the video though, as obviously I've just kind of rambled for just a brief second there. Overall, my takeaway when it comes to the combat system with this game is that they did a great job of making the sword fighting actually feel unique and more than just the same set of animations throughout the whole experience. They also allow us to feel more powerful gradually in a wonderful way. However, at times I do wish if I was to change one thing about the combat system, it would allow us to dive a little deeper and maybe allow us to customize stances, mix and match, so that we could have greater choice as the player, but also have even more in-depth substances. With all the praise that I've just given the sword fighting, I now want to move on to archery, where I can't really give the same level of praise to. I think for a basic system to get the job done, it makes sense as to why it is the way it is. However, when you look into it from a story perspective, it doesn't really make much sense. Jin Sakai is meant to be the student to one of the best archers ever within this world, being Ishwakada, and with that, what ends up happening? He doesn't really learn too much past the intro of his archery lessons right at the beginning of the game. None of the skill tree really does much towards actually making us a better archer. There's not really much in terms of gameplay mechanics that increases your ability to be a better archer, outside of really basic, tiny, minuscule things that really they could have done far more towards. This game's main draw isn't that it has multiple classes or that you can be an archer, so I'm willing to let this go, but that doesn't mean that I wouldn't have preferred this to have some form of system that gave a bit more variety to this side. That could come in the form of something like Assassin's Creed archery system, where you have different types of bows which allow you to do multiple different things. For example, within Assassin's Creed you have things like a bucket shot where you've just got a ton of arrows, or an AoE effect shot, or just a fast draw where you can shoot shoot loads in one go. All of those would have just added some extra layer to make the archery system feel a little bit better, and just generally speaking as if you genuinely improve throughout the game. However, as it wasn't the primary mechanic, I am willing to let this go to a degree. Let's take a moment though and talk about the skill upgrades, as these things end up impacting our way of fighting and in terms of general combat mechanics. The skill tree is done in a really nice way that allows players to feel as if they're actually progressing in the game, but never feeling as if that power creep that I mentioned earlier is too overwhelming. We first have deflection, which the name implies we slowly become a god of defense, from perfect parries through to gaining health with those parries and being able to deflect arrows. This system is set up in a way that allows us to feel more like a powerful samurai who can parry and take down opponents with ease. Then there's the evasion system, which again is very simple. It allows us to dodge and use our momentum to take down enemies. This is no different to what a lot of games do. However, one of my favorite abilities within this was the perfect dodge, and I think it's a really nice little thing to implement that felt unique. The mythic section is also the most enjoyable, and the reason for this is that I believe that they do a great job in making it feel as if you are a badass samurai, and it also uses up your resolve in a unique way. Some definitely feel more incredible than others. However, when combined with a full set of resolve, they can make boss fights feel incredibly easy. And I also really like how you can't just unlock these with points. They have to be done in a unique way. You can't just get enough points and then unlock them. They actually require you to do some form of mission and learn about the origins of their teachings. With the 4 mythics, they are all connected in some way to their own story and ideas that you learn about in their own mythic tales. The Dance of Wrath is my personal favourite, but my favourite questline out of all of them was the Way of the Flame. Evolving tactics also helps with this feeling of power creep. They allow us throughout the entire playthrough to feel like we're either becoming a god in some areas or like a complete novice in others. Some of these though I do think serve that very standard purpose and do it very well. This here is what I would just categorise as your standard skill tree, the one that is helping you out about every single standard gameplay mechanic that you've got and that you'll be interacting with 99% of the time. Ghost weapons are next, however I'm going to leave that for the ability and skills upgrades as a whole. I really like the choice in upgrades within this game when it comes to the equipment, as overall it does end up filling its primary needs, and also they are the fundamentals of this genre of game. At times though I did feel as if they acted way too much as a safety net for the general player. I would enter the fights using this thing, the throwing star thing. I don't even want to attempt to pronounce that, I can't lie, I'm struggling deeply. And I do also really like the reference to the hidden blade that gets mentioned within its skill upgrade. But what this would allow though is for you to take down enemies really easily right away, but would eventually become something that I would just kind of save until I ended up in a bit of trouble, so that way I could kind of save myself and get out of those moments with ease. And if I'm honest, this is kind of the same for most of the ghost weapons. They're great tools, but I wouldn't be surprised if I'm not the only person who doesn't use them in their intended way for stealth approaches. Sometimes I would. For example, I would throw a wind chime down, and then once they gather to that spot, I could then just blow them up with some black powder. Most of the time, however, I would just kind of use them simply as items within fights themselves over utility towards stealth mechanics. The upgrades make sense for what they are meant to be, however, again, I do feel as if they could have treated this a little bit more in the same way as the mythics worked. One-time upgrades, where let's say you end up learning about these things from other users of these items, and then that way it kind of builds up this idea of just becoming better and learning through others instead of just gaining this random skill one day. Then they could have also given us the chance to upgrade those pieces of gear to maybe allow us to carry more and whatnot via, the crafting system that they already have embedded in the game. This would have been a generally nicer gamer system, however, I am willing to let this go, as again, I am nitpicking just a little bit here. To finish off talking about the combat through the lens that we have been, I want to talk about the final stance that I haven't discussed at all just yet in its proper depth anyway, which is the ghost stance. It's just great fun. Honestly, I don't really have much to say about it. It's fun to use. A more recent game that reminds me of this is Jedi Survivor and being able to turn to the dark side. It does at times though feel a tad overpowered, especially in boss fights, which I'll get into in a moment. However, I do think they really struck the perfect balance most of the time of waiting until later into the game to give you access to this and only allowing you to use it within certain moments and only allowing you to kill up to 3 people, for example. When talking about the combat of any game, one of the key things that we need to take into account as well is boss fights if they exist within the game, which is one of this game's weakest parts. And I'm willing to make the entire claim here, which is that this game has no good boss fights besides the DLC's final boss, which is insane considering the majority of players haven't played the DLC. However, I am willing to stake my claim on this idea, which is that there is no good boss fights within the primary game. The reason that I say that there is no good boss fights in this game is that they all feel the same, but with a new lick of paint over them. Almost all of them are just different variations of Mongol leaders or Ronin warriors or Straw Hats, all of which have nothing personality-wise to differentiate them at all. They also don't really have much in the way of abilities that kind of makes them unique in any way. The Khan is the only exception to this fact, in my opinion, within the base game, but even if we look at the boss fight itself, it's actually quite shocking about how bad the end game boss fight actually is. You jump between a couple of fighting styles and that's it. Then you treat him like any other enemy when you go onto the ship and you have to fight him against multiple people at the same time. The abilities, and specifically Ghost Mode as well, is something that I really want to bring up here. I found that going into a boss fight with no resolve would actually make the fight quite difficult, or at least at times more drawn out as an experience. However, in those moments, the only reason why I was wanting to get resolve was to gain back health for parries. To an extent, I kind of wish that things like Ghost Mode and the mythical abilities weren't allowed. You know, so that at least that way in the fight it's dedicated as a duel to the death, something that has got some honor about it instead of being able to whip out some fancy new skill that you have. All of the fights become incredibly easy and laughable many times within this game because of all of these abilities. The example that I've mentioned within this video was Rizzo. I didn't even try to go into that fight with all of my resolve. It just turned out that because, you know, you're going in there and you're doing a lot of stealth, you gain a lot of your resolve and you walk in, and within probably around 20 seconds, he was dead. All because I had a few abilities that could then tear apart every single skilled warrior in front of me. Stealth is something that you've heard me talk about many points throughout this video, and if you can't tell, I actually quite like open world games that allow you to do some lovely stealth action. And also, I don't really care if it's overly basic most of the time. I love the Ezio collection, for example, even though it's got some really rudimentary stealth mechanics. Before you get upset with me about saying that, I do have my own personal take on the Assassin's Creed franchise that I've mentioned before in prior videos, which is that a lot of the beginning games aren't really proper stealth games. More that you're just kind of forced into doing things from time to time that has some stealth mechanics in there. And it took them 5 entries, 7 if you include Brotherhood and Revelations, to add a crouch button. This game does have stealth, that is true. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's particularly good. We have some general basics covered, such as being able to hide behind walls, crouch, and be in tall grass. However, this game is missing a couple smaller things that would have just made the quality of life experience for stealth way better, but also one massive thing that games for over 2 decades that have any form of stealth in them probably have, and they're probably games that you love as well. The one feature that this game is missing, and it becomes more and more obvious as you play this game, is the ability to hide bodies. Like, come on, it's a stealth game. Dishonored from 2012, with half the budget this game has this feature. Metal Gear 2, Sons of Liberty, has the same feature, and it's from 2001. It's older than me, and it had this feature. If you take inflation into account, still, even half the cost of this game. So why isn't it here? Eventually, when you're taking down a camp and a guard spots a body whilst you're trying to deal with another guard over there or doing an objective, it just becomes incredibly obvious that this feature just seems to be oddly missing out of this game. Why can't I just drag an enemy into some long grass or shove them into a tent? One of the 2 features that would be outstanding to see in the next title is some form of directional awareness. The fact that I can get within 180 degrees of an angle within an enemy's visible, point of view, and somehow can't get caught when I've killed their best bud who stood right next to them feels strange to me. And again, I know that many other games have this exact same issue, and to anyone who does say that to me, I would say, yeah, that's fair enough. However, I'm allowed to have the same critique of this game as I would towards those other games as well. So adding the enemy's ability to just kind of look around a bit, be able to turn their head a little bit instead of being like Batman within The Dark Knight, where he had to upgrade his armor so that he could even look around instead of just being looking and pointed directly in front of him. The second is something that's definitely me more out there as an ask is something that very few games do as well, which is that when you get into a camp and take out a guard, in theory, that's their colleague, but they just never, try to find their missing colleague, or they don't report it at all to the leader of the camp, or put anyone on high alert because someone's gone missing. To me, this would be a very big ask, obviously, as it's changing up an entire AI system as to how these characters are working, and it would be interesting to add if they wanted to bring in more stealth as a focus within the next game. Overall, I think the biggest letdown for me in this game was its stealth. Pretty much nowhere within this game does stealth feel required. Outside of very few story missions and one side mission, does stealth actually get forced upon the player in any meaningful way, but they're so tiny in terms of the general runtime of this game and general experience that the player is going to go through, they're not really worthwhile talking about as defying this idea. While I love this feature and it made Yuna's side mission stand out far more, it also showed a glaring flaw to me, and it ended up making me ask the question as to why wasn't this feature of stealth more of a focus within this game? When you consider that the idea within this game is that you're meant to be the Ghost of Tsushima, he is fighting the idea of just being the honorable samurai, yet the stealth system itself doesn't really suit the idea for what it's trying to tell as a gameplay system. One of the big things that you probably have heard, and many people told to me before playing this game for the first time, is that this game is what the RPG Assassin's Creed games should have been. However, generally speaking, I wasn't going into this game feeling as if the parkour was going to be outstanding. As really, at that time when I actually got into really playing it for the first time, which was obviously just a couple of months ago, if not just a month ago, it wasn't really at the front of my mind when playing. However, during my playthrough, it just kind of kept creeping up on me when I was playing, and I was just thinking to myself about that one comment about how this game is meant to be what the RPG Assassin's Creeds were meant to be. Which, generally speaking, has really made me question what this is meant to mean. However, what this really made me realise is that my claims that I made within my Assassin's Creed Mirage video are true. This take was that nobody really cared about the parkour. They care about the way it's implemented and used within the world, which makes sense as to why nobody really cares about how awful the parkour is in this game. Nobody really cared about the parkour within AC this whole time deep down. They only cared about it either when it made it look beautiful, like they did within AC Unity, or when it was completely useless and a waste of time of even putting time and effort into it, like we got within many of the RPG games. So let's be very clear on what I actually enjoyed about the game, and also what I didn't. So what I really liked about it was the grappling hook. I thought that this made the parkour far more enjoyable and felt way more fluid as an addition to this game. It made sense as well, and it actually had a practical reason for its existence. I also really enjoyed being able to crawl under things, however I did find myself on many occasions finding it a little bit clunky. You can crawl under certain areas of the game, but doing so brings you into first person, and when you're playing a third person title, it does feel a little bit off. I would have rather they just gone third person and either just made it so like the entire thing just disappeared or something off your screen for a moment or something. I don't know what else they could have done, but yeah, it just felt a little bit odd. The parkour, however, is generally just not good. It's worse than every single Assassin's Creed entry. The game has this moment where it goes in between the normal movement and then it trying to do some form of variant of its parkour. However, at times it just looks really weird and just off-putting because it doesn't know whether or not it wants to prioritize normal movement or the parkour. Which again, I'm going to say is completely fair as this wasn't the priority and one of the big features that was the selling point of this game. However, it does help break the experience for me. The parkour wasn't a big issue in the grand scheme of things. However, when it comes to it, it was a comment that I wanted to bring up, as many people talk about how this is what the RPG Assassin's Creed games should have been. I always thought when I was being told this that meant that parkour must have been at least relatively decent, but this game gave me a newfound appreciation for Assassin's Creed's parkour. The most impactful and quite possibly one of the best implementations of a gameplay mechanic I've ever seen in a game across the board, and is rarely spoken about as a reason to play the game, but is definitely up there as almost everyone's favourite thing deep down out of the game, which is the guiding wind. I think that this might have been the most innovative way of having a guiding system in any game. It allows for the HUD to not be rammed with tons of stuff like minimaps or compasses or other random bits and pieces. It allows the game to be the front and centre of your mind. All you have to do is slide up on your controller, and instead of having arrows coming up, up directing you to where you're going to go, or a line on the floor taking you there. Instead, the wind comes up really briefly and lets you know which direction you need to be going. This is something that I truly enjoyed. Every time I used it, I was thinking about how wonderful of an experience this was. It's such a simple mechanic, especially when we get to look at it now. However, it's obviously not one that many other people thought of, considering no other games really have something this similar to what you've got within Ghost of Tsushima. It hardly interrupts your playtime, and you still feel immersed without having to open up your map all of the time. Let's take a moment to talk about the armor and upgradables. I honestly think they did a good job on both of these sections. However, there are still areas that I wish they improve on so that the next game is even better. What I really liked about this game, and I thought was really cool, was the armor, especially everything that was above level 3. Almost all of it looked really cool. One of the things that I absolutely adored about Assassin's Creed 2, and eventually we saw it in Black Flag as well, and most games have gotten rid of this as an aspect, is being able to visibly see the armor upgrades in front of us. So seeing that within this game was something that I truly loved. It visually shows us the progress that we are having, and in any game, if this feature exists, it will have my heart. Now, this was something that I did love. However, what I didn't like was how most of these armor pieces feel really useless and non-functional. In a way, I would have preferred if the armor sets were less, and then just allowed us to upgrade them in specific ways to create builds that affect the playstyle that we wanted to have. As the only two bits of armor that actually felt useful in any way and made a big difference to your gameplay was the Clan Sakai armor and the Ghost armor. With that, you also never really got any visual change between level 3 and 4, and in most cases, I could just rock the level 3 armor, and the upgrade that you actually got between 3 and 4 was so useless that it meant there was no sense to upgrading and using up your items for it. The last area of what I'm going to designate within the gameplay category is going to be everything about the looting system, all the way from, just your inventory, collecting things, and just how it all works. Which I think, for the scope of the game, they did a really good job of doing exactly that and having a decent enough inventory system that functioned well. However, there is some areas that I didn't like about it. For the most part, I do really like the inventory system. They don't give you a lot of stuff, and they really don't make you think about a lot outside of the sets of armor and cosmetic choices that you have, like the typical sheaths that you could try on. Which for me is good. I think for the most part in this game, where the story is meant to be the main factor of what's dragging your attention away and the combat, it kind of doesn't make sense for you to just kind of, be able to pick up 300 different types of swords. With that though, I do want to talk about what is probably the biggest issue within this category, for me anyway, and I wouldn't be surprised if for many of you it's pretty similar, is the general looting system. You just run into tents and then spam the trigger button until there is nothing else to collect and then leave. This makes it feel as if it's mostly meaningless. Most of the materials you're also picking up kind of just get lumped into the same sort of categories together for you to just use eventually for upgraded armor. If you're going to be lazy with this system, at least just make it so that the raw materials, for example, have some form of intended purpose. Instead of having 3 main categories, create 15 different subcategories where certain bits will be used for certain armors and whatnot. Either this, or just only have it so that the only way that you can pick up the majority of stuff like this is via searching chests, ending missions, or just, generally finishing off bigger things, so there's levels of intentionality with this aspect of looting. This took away a big mechanic for me that most open worlds do, which is having a looting system that makes you feel like you're picking up stuff and then you're just kind of carrying it around. I want to be able to pick things up, be aware of what I'm getting, and have a system like an inventory carry capacity. Like, how is Jin able to run around here throwing his blade around so quickly, but then he's holding multiple gold bars in his pocket? It makes no sense. I understand this is just game being game, but it's just one of those things where when you think about it just a little bit, it makes you question. Again, like many things so far, I am willing to let this go, as it is the first entry within this franchise, and there's definitely more that they can do within the next game. However, this all ties into a theme that I'm going to discuss at the end of the video. One of the most important aspects, if not the most important aspect, of every open world game out there is the world you're exploring and how they immerse you within it. This game has a lot going for it. Everything from how often we encounter new things, through to the look this game has, and how it's probably the most visually stunning game to ever exist. So let's break this down into 5 areas that I think really make this game feel amazing. The first of which is going to be the look and feel of every single act. Ghost of Tsushima, as I've said, is probably the most stunning game, frame for frame, that has ever existed. Mix this with the way that the game handles the look and feel of every single section of this game to make you feel a certain way about the way the story is going and the way our character is, really makes us grounded within the experience that we are having. This isn't a new thing. Many games do this, most movies do this with its lighting and colour grading, and many other areas of storytelling mediums do this. What you'll notice with this game is that within the first act, it's incredibly vibrant and green, and everywhere you look, it looks beautiful. But as time goes on, you're going to see the damage that the war does, and that as soon as you go up further north, the land is striking as a contrast to where you were at the beginning of the game. This makes us inherently feel great when running around the world. We're in really nice environments, and everything about this part of the game just makes us feel good and as if we're beginning a journey. Hence why the look and feel of this act is done in the way that it is. In a way, it is basically the most stereotypical way to show us that we are green, aka new to something. We're in the beginning stages, the flurry of just how the game is going to make us feel. The second act of this game opens up showing us the destruction left in the wake of the Mongol horde heading north. We can see what they have done. So much of the land is scorched, and a lot of the second act feels far darker and dingy, but we still have some areas, like the shrubbery, that is truly beautiful left over in some parts of the map. A lot of this part of the map is either covered in forests to go through, or it's burnt to a crisp, with maybe some lakes in between here and there. By the time of the third act though, everything is gone. It's snowy, it's cold, it's dark. It all has its own feeling in every single part of the game. We also get to see Jin's homeland at different points, which has its own striking visual duality to the world that we've experienced so far with its red blossom trees. They allow us to know that we are here. We're in a place that Jin keeps thinking back to, the home, the area of the map that you are supposed to feel safe within. Once you enter into Act 3, the tone has changed. Not just because Jin is now an outcast and being hunted down by the samurai, well, or as he's meant to, as previously discussed, but also because it uses visual storytelling to make us feel like we're in a new environment that is coarse and rough. It's snowy, cold and grey, lacking any form of life that gives us any form of hope. As by this point in the story, we're now gone from hope. We're now in full desperation mode. All 3 acts do a perfect job of visually being shown off in their way that uses the environmental method of storytelling. We don't end up feeling the ways that we do because we're an outcast to the samurai world, but also because we're in dangerous territory. We are fighting for our lives in any given moment. We're in the exact opposite of this title's original location, with its warm and vibrant, and at times tropical environments that make you feel blatantly like this is a hot area to live in and a very nice area to live in. This to me is what this game does outstandingly well without looking as if they're trying too hard to convey any particular feelings. It's not the stereotypical thing that happened in movies where everything is dark and suddenly it starts raining and thundering when something bad is about to happen. It feels natural as it's providing these unique feelings that this game is meant to be portraying to us throughout each act. The next of the 5 areas that truly makes any open world feel alive is random encounters. However, this game takes this a little bit overboard, and not in a good way. It goes over the top with giving you tons of them all the time, but they never at any point feel unique because they are almost all the same. This is probably the biggest flaw in this game's open world immersion and exploration. We can ride for maybe 20 to 40 seconds and then go into a random encounter, which is a good thing, but it's only at times a good thing. It's good by the rules of the 40-second rule of open world encounters that CD Projekt Red followed when making The Witcher 3. However, these are meant to include other things than just random encounters. This repetitiveness comes from the fact that we see this all throughout the game in so many different locations. It's not just a one-off experience, or maybe it happens 5 or 10 times throughout your entire playthrough. These are all of the time, but they aren't even just repetitive because of the sheer quantity, but also because, by sheer definition, they are repetitive. They are almost entirely the same 3 types over and over. That first point is that they should have removed over half of these encounters, as it becomes honestly kind of annoying and pushes me to the point of avoidance. You could be riding to a location, then maybe stumble across one fight, do that sort of encounter. Then you're riding for another 30 seconds and stumble across yet another that's almost identical to the one that you've just done. But because you're trying to ride up north and go to your next location, it just pushes you to a point of like, okay, why am I having to do the same sort of encounter over and over and over because I'm having to ride for like 100 meters. It's one of those things that makes sense as to why it's there, however, it's a tad overdone. With that though, I do feel as if there is a need for more variety in these types of events. Not just Mongols or Straw Hats stealing from people, or a group of them scouting on a bear attack. It becomes incredibly repetitive very quickly. Hopefully, a feature that I would like to see, and it would be interesting to see if it can be brought into it, is something like the RPG Assassin's Creeds, is that they could have some form of system like the mercenary system that makes it a little bit more interesting as you're going around the world. Having it that the Mongols want to pay others to kill Jin completely makes sense to the story. Why wouldn't it make sense for the Khan to then also want to, deal with that wild card that is Jin Sakai through the manner of paying people to go take him down? This could have opened up the ability to have actual boss encounters that come up randomly throughout your playthrough in a unique way, or just straight up stumbling on them while traveling. Outside of this, maybe just having other features where, a bandit has come to kill you off the side of the road, or some robber is luring you into a location where he's acting like his friend is there and then they try and rob you. And this would make perfect sense within the world, as whenever an actual conflict does happen, there's always someone somewhere trying to benefit off of that exact thing. Overall, just having a few more variations of random encounters would have made these feel a little bit less repetitive. The next component in this game's open world is the enemy encampments, which I think, again, this game does pretty well in its execution. I don't really have much to say outside of maybe having a couple more boss fight encounters with these encampments, as it could then open it up to feel more grandiose than what it actually feels within this game. But also, my complaints around the AI and what I mentioned earlier are kind of my main complaints here, as again, it is an issue about how dumb these encampments can feel because you're just going against enemies that are genuinely stupid. Let's talk about random activities. These aren't the same as random encounters, which personally I actually found myself really enjoying. Not because they did anything inherently interesting or outstanding, but it's because the job that they did perfectly fine, which is just to slow down the pace of the game a little bit to allow you to have that moment to breathe. These are the activities like cutting through bamboo, following the foxes, and finding hot springs. These are the welcome additions that I wish more games had. Just things that exist for the sake of making us slow down just a little, to take in the smaller moments and the smaller areas of the game. Not just the grand scale of the massive open world that you're exploring, but those moments where you are following the foxes into their own little area that gives you some form of view out to sea. Or maybe it's something along the lines of just going up to some bamboo and chopping through it. All of this is designed in a way just to make us breathe and take a moment away from rampant questing. Final aspect that I pray they do again, or I hope that they do again that they haven't done in this game, is not giving the ability to have auto horses. If you've seen my open worlds video essay, you'll know that I have an issue with this mechanic. I think it's a really cheap thing to add into your game and it ruins immersion, not just makes it a little bit worse, but straight up destroys the ability to be immersed. Yes, a game like RDR2 had auto horses, but it required you to go into cinematic mode, which personally I wasn't a fan of, which meant I never used it. It's something that made me focus on horse riding and getting to my location without picking up my phone in the process. If you play Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Odyssey, or Origins, you'll notice that you can put your horse into auto sprint and just leave it there for 10 minutes to go to your desired location. This for me is an absolute failure in game design. All it does is make people bored and step away from the game to scroll TikTok, watch YouTube, or do literally anything else, which is why I consider it a core pillar to the open world genre. By not having this in this game, it made me feel like RDR2 did, and it made me focus far more on the game I was playing. Your argument back to me might be, well, just don't use it if it's there. However, this leads into why these games have it in the first place and why others don't, which is the other key pillar of these open world games, which I've mentioned before, which is the random encounters that are meant to make the world more interesting. When people think about Ghost of Tsushima, especially those who have actually played the game all the way through, they're not thinking necessarily entirely anyway about the story, the world you're exploring, or the combat. I believe most people, especially when they're describing this game to other people, are talking about how visually stunning this game is. That might be an incorrect statement, however I do genuinely believe this to be the case, as this game is probably one of the most beautiful games ever made. There are strong contenders against this title, however I don't think any game does it as good as this game does frame for frame. I don't know what it is about the game, but they just hit everything perfectly when it comes to bringing that visual look to life. A side tangent that I'm about to go on though is this discussion around the bigger divide that divides many players today, which is this idea that game companies seem to be, making their games as photorealistic and as beautiful as possible versus the game having their own art style. I see a lot of this conversation online about how people supposedly don't care about graphics in any way, and that they would rather play something that has its own style but plays good. However, I believe that this game is proof that most people would disagree. Sure, not even 10% of players have played Ghost of Tsushima, however, I do believe that this game has its own art style in a way. However, it all stems from this idea of photorealism. You get outstanding visuals in this game, so much that it pushes everyone, including myself, to use the photo mode, which this game is one of the only ones to ever make me want to use it, because it looks outstanding. The reason that I'm bringing this up is that even though I played this game on the PS5 and on the director's cut of this game, I do believe that I would have been perfectly content with playing it at 30 FPS, as many of my favourite games ever made are 30 FPS. I also know that this game was loved when it first came out, even though it was running at 30 FPS. The only people that I ever heard talking about this and complaining about this topic, with this game in particular, are what I class as FPS snobs. What I like about this game is that it is one of the most AAA gamer games that have ever come out in recent memory, outside of maybe some Ubisoft titles, but it also spits in the face of many elitist gamers out there who will only play certain types of games because they believe that they are superior to others. Which for me is a massive win, as personally I am kind of sick of being told by people about how I should accept worse quality graphics solely so that I can get an extra 10 FPS over here. Personally, I don't care very much about the FPS of most games. Let's jump back into complaining just for one moment, as I need to talk about probably one of the biggest and most jarring parts of this game that I haven't really brought up overly, too much just yet, which is the black screening. People who complain about Bethesda having loading screens and all these big issues, but they don't complain about this that often. I understand that these are only, 3 to 5 seconds long, but I can't think of any other reason why these exist outside of budgetary requirements for the game. It does feel a tad lazy at times, and it's just really jarring when they happen. I would by far prefer having an actual loading screen that gives you some form of information, just so that it at least has something there, than it just black screening out of nowhere because they couldn't be asked to add some little details. This was probably the biggest issue for me in this game. I found it genuinely awful and would get to the point where I would verbally be complaining when nobody was there to listen. For example, you'll do a mission with Rizzo where he needs you to go onto a Mongol ship and search for supplies. Instead of making a, 2 to 5 second swimming animations that you could get to the point and, it just avoids the black screen, we end up just getting hit with that black screen for the 2 to 5 seconds. This would be fine, but the fact that this happens so often while you're in high stakes moments completely takes away from that feeling of high stakes. If there is one thing out of this video that I hope the developers see and they decide not to bring into the second game, it is those black screen loading screens. Now though, let's go back to giving this game plenty of love, as I want to talk about the DLC, which is by far one of the best parts of this game. Firstly, like the main story, it is stunning in terms of its visual appearance. This game isn't going to be lacking in that department. However, internally, when it comes to what you're actually getting from a narrative sense, all the way through, is in my opinion, miles better. The story is a perfect length for a DLC, especially if they just want it to be extra content that isn't on the same level as, let's say, Blood and Wine when it comes to a DLC. I do wish that we got more time with the characters that we end up meeting, however again, it does so in a perfect blend of introducing us to new characters while still allowing us to focus primarily on Jin and his inner conflict. Throughout the DLC, we'll see Jin being tormented in worse ways than the base game over the death of his father. The base game focuses on the acceptance of who he is, but the DLC is focusing on all of his forgiveness about who he was and what he necessarily didn't do. I love the fact that we learn about how the natives of this land feel about Clan Sakai, and also the twist that I wasn't actually expecting, which was the guy that you're walking around with the whole time turns out to be the guy who killed Jin's father. Seeing him deal with Tenzo was wonderful. Seeing him not only being a man who's learned to become the warrior he needed to be, but also having the humility and empathy to realize that the actions weren't taken in a way to hurt him, but to make them feel safer was great. Overall, how this game handles its story is genuinely amazing. We don't have much going on within the DLC that takes away from the narrative that's going on, which is really great as it allows us to explore Jin's true struggle and come to accept what is happening, and it all leads up to the final battle of the DLC, which is the boss battle, which is done wonderfully, not only as an emotional piece, but also as a boss fight. Within this fight, we see Jin fully accept his past. He goes right up into the face of the moment and confronts his father, who is really his subconscious mind that has been calling him a failure all of these years for not being able to save his dad. And in this moment, he is coming to accept what happened, and that in this moment, he couldn't have done anything else. We also get to see the one and only proper boss fight in this game that actually feels like a boss fight. And what I mean by this is that we actually get to use all of the stances, and that alone makes this feel way more like a challenge. You actually have to think a little bit more than just your standard parry and dodge, as now you also have the stances, which now means you have to think about the combos. This made the fight feel far more fluid and mentally stimulating than any other boss fight within this game by far. And I'm really glad that I actually played the DLC after finishing the main story, as I did accidentally start playing the DLC without realizing I was playing the DLC for a moment until I couldn't actually leave the island, and I had to wait a moment in that DLC to get there in the first place, which was a little bit annoying. However, I'm glad that I pushed myself after the game finished to give the DLC a proper shot, as I was honestly contemplating just not playing it, as I was just struggling to get myself into it. In the process of making this video, Ghost of Yotei was announced with its own trailer, which always seems to happen to me. Whenever I'm making a video about something, because of how long it takes to make these, I end up having some random thing thrown in there that now ruins a part of the video that I was originally planning to do, which in this case was talking about a possible sequel with Jin Sakai. I'm still going to talk about how they could do a sequel at some point, however, I still don't think it's probably going to ever happen, but if it does, please take note of some of these ideas. You know, Sucker Punch, hire me if you want to as your writer for your next game. But overall, I'm going to talk about both this Ghost of Yotei game and what I would like to see within that, and also if Jin Sakai was to receive a sequel, what that would look like. Firstly, I do think that this game looks really good. Generally, I'm excited to play this title, however, I am a little disappointed that Jin will not be the protagonist. Not because I have an issue necessarily with the voice actor or anything like that, honestly, I haven't really been looking into any of that drama too much, but it's purely because, personally, I wanted to see the story continue of Jin Sakai and see what was going to happen from there. For me, this felt like a very Ubisoft decision to make. Instead of making the pre-existing character into your next game, they just chose to create a whole new one, which to me does feel like a bit of a cop-out. I get why they did it. One of the reasons is obviously they get to make an entire new story with no baggage previously added. Secondly, they're able to go to the mainland in a slightly different fashion than they might have been able to do otherwise with Jin Sakai. However, they also end up getting out of what I refer to as the Ezio effect. What I mean by this is that in Assassin's Creed, Ezio is one of the most beloved characters in the entire franchise, if not the most beloved, and I do think there is 3 primary reasons as to why. One is that his character is incredibly likable and charismatic. People enjoyed playing as him and experiencing his story. The second is that for many of us, this was the first game we played in this franchise, so there is obviously that love because it was the first one we played. But the last reason, and I do believe is the most pivotal reason, is that he was the only character to receive multiple entries. We got to spend more time with his character, over more of his life, and experience more of his story as it developed, which led to many people loving his character, but also many people questioning why, for years and years, other characters didn't get the same treatment. Why was it that we didn't receive a sequel for Connor, for Arno, for Shay, for Edward Kenway, for any of these characters, but we only got it for Ezio, when we could have had it for these other ones as well, instead of just having them with a one and done entry. However, as I said, I am still certainly interested to see what this game does with its character and setting, especially considering we are also going to a new time setting, so that opens up new avenues for us to go down. So let's talk about what I would actually like to see within this next game. My first desire is already met, which is going to mainland Japan. So we'll move on to the next few. I want to see the black screens completely gone entirely. Just remove them, there's no point of them being there. Put actual loading screens in there if need be. Do what Skyrim did. I would much rather at least have some form of information on the screen than nothing at all. Or do what companies have done for many years, including Sony very specifically, which is having interactive moments that act as loading screens. My next desired change would be to have more of a focus this time around on stealth mechanics and improving their parkour. The most fun missions in this game were the moments where you get ghost mode, but also the missions where it really focused and forced stealth onto the player. They made you actually have to think and focus far more on getting the thing done that you're there to do. I love this game and I want to see more focus on the stealth in the second one. Maybe enabling players to go stealth through the entire playthrough instead of just having it as a part of the character's toolkit. Add in the rest of what I mentioned earlier while we're at it as well. Make the AI a little bit smarter and just utilize a focus around stealth in some of the missions far more than they did within the first game. I would like to see a bigger variety in the random encounters that we see, like I mentioned earlier on. However, there is one big change that I believe would be needed in this next game, which is to make our actions actually matter. Have more moments in this game that actually lead to a different moment in the game later on. Maybe have an honor-based system that they could easily get away with if they actually chose to add it in there, so it makes us have more control over our actions and actually play out the game in the way that sees to our playstyle. The fact that you could do as much as possible to be the most honorable character in this first game, do everything outside of the moments that are completely forced, and you still end up in the same predicament in the end is insane to me. I don't mind if there is a similar ending within this game. However, I do think that they need to allow the player to have more freedom over the choices that they're making and how it impacts the ending of the story, as if they don't, I believe the player base will just expect nothing to really matter throughout most of our playthrough, and with that, just to have some big choice right at the end. While playing Ghost of Tsushima, I had one question coming to the top of my mind all the time, which was, is the comparison to Assassin's Creed correct? I know that it's not used in a negative context, however I did want to discuss this idea as I do believe there is a massive amount of overlap between this game and the Assassin's Creed fanbase. Because simply put, the idea of this game is very much Ubisoft coated. A lot of this game does take heavy inspiration from the Ubisoft open world format. I want to first say that I do think the comparison is fair in so much that you're only comparing the RPG trilogy, which I guess most people are when they say that this is what the RPG titles should have been. However, I do think to an extent it kind of overlooks the primary issue with the RPG titles in Assassin's Creed, which is for a completely different video in itself that I could do a massive deep dive into, but the short answer is you can't put lipstick on a pig. With this game, I do believe the comparison works, however it does fall short when you start to take into account stealth and parkour. While I have highlighted the reasons that I don't think this was necessarily a big issue because it wasn't the primary focus of this game, I do believe that if you're someone like me who had been hearing for ages now that this comparison was here, that, you know, this is what the RPG Assassin's Creeds were meant to be like, you will kind of build up this idea in your head that they would have, you know, some form of decent parkour or some form of decent stealth. This game is also very blatantly a good capitalization on the market of gamers who feel disenfranchised by Ubisoft in the way that they've treated Assassin's Creed. With this capitalization though, they did also miss out on some of the fundamental features that were the big staples of Assassin's Creed. Obviously, we could just say that Assassin's Creed had nothing to do with this game and that we shouldn't even be bringing it up into the conversation. But I would disagree, as I do think that it plays heavily into the baseline level of what this game is meant to be like. When you consider a lot of the fundamental gameplay mechanics, the setting, and the fact that the plot is going around this idea of being this loud and proud character who has to utilize being in the shadows, it seems fairly understandable that people would talk about Assassin's Creed. The comparison is valid, however I do believe that Ghost of Yotei does have the possibility to dethrone Ubisoft at their own game, making their entire way of creating content completely invalid, and making it brutally honest to them how they can improve on their formula. But also, they could make a mockery out of Ubisoft very easily if Ghost of Yotei is miles better than Assassin's Creed Shadows. We'll have to wait and see about the experience that both of these games give us, as they are going to be fairly comparable when it comes to what they're trying to offer to the player, but realistically, what we need to see is which one is able to bring more value to the experience that we're looking for. If I was going to put any bet on that, I would probably say that Ghost of Yotei is going to come out on top. There are 3 lessons that I've learned while playing this game. Sure, we have the lessons from the story, but this is going to be about the game as a whole. These are lessons about gaming that this game has highlighted to me. The first of which is to have low expectations or none at all when playing a game for the first time. I've already spoken about this in other videos, but really this game has cemented this idea for me. The reason that I say this is that I had pre-existing ideas that hindered the areas of this game that I could have enjoyed otherwise, but also because I had areas that I hadn't even thought about too much and I found myself falling in love with. What this lesson has made me want to do more than anything is retry the RPG Assassin's Creed games again. I already love Origins, however Odyssey is one that I always struggled to really give a proper go, and then I obviously already have my pre-existing views massively on AC Valhalla, so I doubt I'll be able to jump back into that game. But overall, I would be really interested in trying to go into Assassin's Creed Odyssey with as little pre-existing ideas and just trying to disconnect from my already established viewpoint on this game and of this trilogy. The reason that this lesson is one to truly think on is because out of anything, there are 2 primary killers of enjoyment within any game. One is that they're simply just bad products, and the other is having an unrealistic idea about the game and having over-the-top expectations as to the experience that you're about to go on. For me, this is why I don't have any expectations for GTA 6. I have faith in Rockstar that they're going to provide a groundbreaking experience. It's why I might have felt a little bit disappointed about the idea that we weren't seeing Jin's story continue. However, I do have faith that Sucker Punch are going to provide yet again another great experience. Both of these examples obviously still have their levels of expectations, that being better than the previous entry and obviously waiting on that idea of a groundbreaking experience or yet again another great experience is still putting some level of expectation towards it. However, like I said, generally speaking, this idea comes from the idea of just having faith in the publishers / development team to actually create a great experience that players will love instead of making it something that we don't. Really, for this game, it should be pretty easy. They could just add a few different features and subtract and hone in on the experience far more now that they know what people like and didn't like about the first game. The next lesson is to allow inspiration to strike you. If I take you back to the beginning of this video, I brought up that there is one thing that made me want to play this game in the first place, that pushed me to actually give the game a proper shot again, which was Shogun. This for me was a massive realization. I would always find myself wanting to play certain games, but the motivation never seemed to come around. What I've realized is that inspiration is the key to pushing me to play games or even working on new creative endeavors. Utilizing inspiration can bring you to the point of actually doing the things that you wanted to be doing in the first place. However, this isn't something that I'd recommend generally speaking. I don't believe inspiration is the only part playing in this, but I also do believe that for me it was a massive factor in trying to enjoy something new that I've done with this game in particular. The final lesson that I learned whilst playing this game is that for a game to be amazing, it doesn't have to be the best ever made or the best game in any one category. It doesn't need to excel in just one thing. And on the other hand, it doesn't have to just be great in a handful of things. This game is a great game, but not because the stealth is amazing, or because the story is groundbreaking, or because the combat is over the top impressive, but because it does a great job at all of these things and more that makes this game a well-rounded experience. This is the reason that people truly love this game. This lends to the idea that I've had for a long time, which is that you need to focus far more on how a game makes us feel and stop caring deeply about the nitty-gritty details of performance. Games are a work of art, especially games like Ghost of Tsushima. Sure, we do judge some level of art with the idea around it needing to be technically amazing and how impressive it needs to be, but what most of us won't do is vocalize how this actual thing is making us feel. Instead, we disguise it under the idea of the technicalities around the FPS, around the graphics, everything around a game's development, instead of thinking about the experience that the game is meant to be giving you. A game doesn't have to be a masterpiece to impact you deeply, to bring you to the point of tears, or to just have a great time. This game can be summed up by one quote: "A jack of all trades, a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one." This links to the idea that I've discovered whilst scripting this video, but primarily been discussing throughout this video, which is that almost every single aspect of this game has a better alternative out there, but very rarely does any game do all of these things relatively well. This to me is what this game is. It's a great game, simply because it didn't try to excel at just one thing or a handful of things, but because it wanted to do a great job across the board. My comments around the parkour, for example. This game gave me a newfound appreciation for Assassin's Creed parkour. However, it also did do parkour to a basic level to serve its functionality. The parkour was never its selling point. With Assassin's Creed, they made it one of their selling points, hence why every single game that comes out ends up getting judged heavily on its parkour. This game for me was a wonderful experience. It came to me during a time of mental acceptance over the future of my life. It'll probably always be connected to this feeling in some way, similar to how music can make you go back to this feeling that you may have felt or a memory that you were in when you were listening to it either for the first time or when you were really getting into it. It'll hold a really high regard in what I end up discussing moving forward when it comes to other games and just other concepts around games. From the storytelling being a great work of art, through to the combat being enjoyable and the world feeling like they wanted to tell a story with its experience, this game does a lot right, and with that makes it truly great. It's a jack of all trades, which is outstanding, as very few games actually try to do this. Most just focus on a very limited set of things and excel in those. Truly what this game made me realise though is that I actually can enjoy games if I step back and allow myself to enjoy them. My mind doesn't like doing nothing, or at least that feeling as if I'm doing nothing that many games end up making me feel, but this game wasn't one of them, and it was able to override that feeling. So thank you Sucker Punch for making a game like it, and I hope that Ghost of Yotei is able to be anywhere near what this title is. If you did make it to the end of this video, thank you. It's been a very long time since I've made a video anywhere near the magnitude of this one. I want to do far more like this, where I dive deeper into a game, not necessarily from its gameplay mechanics, but from the stories that we can take away from its plot, but also that the game is able to teach us in the way that it works. So if you did enjoy this video, please make sure to leave a like, and whilst you're down there, hit the subscribe button. What I will ask for though is that if you did enjoy this video and you do want to support me further than just subscribing to the channel, then please check out the Patreon down below. For me to be able to take breaks like this and make videos like it, I do end up requiring some form of viewer support, so thank you for those who already are, but also just thank you for watching if you aren't interested in doing that either. I've already posted a load of behind the scenes about this video, so it's already up on the Patreon if you're interested and want to check it out. But with that all being said, I hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, leave a like, do subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good one.